彼女のその行為が本当にその時後からになってもどんな気持ちだったのかな、どんなに辛かったのかなっていうのがもう何十年経っても忘れることができないし、なんとか彼女をかばうこともできなかったのかなっていうことが今でもねすごい辛い。その違いを差別的に侮蔑的に指摘されるっていうその怖さっていう。
死因は向川町というところです。私の所属している団体は目の子もしもしというアイヌ女性の活動する団体です。先祖から受け継いだ文化の発信とか、それからアイヌ食についての環境とかその背景とかについてメンバーと一緒に活動しております。
三野智子と申します。私もアイヌ女性会議目の子もしもしのメンバーです。白老町出身です。母がアイヌ民族であります。私は職業としては、アイヌの子どもたち、アイヌの指定の教育の相談員という職業をしております。今日は私の、職場でありますコタンに、皆さんやってきていただきました。
That's me, Talia. My name is Talia Smith and I am a journalist. I started this documentary media platform, Incendiary Balloons, to tell a story of overlooked Black, Indigenous people of color, and really any overlooked voice all over the world. Today we are focusing on one particular area, Japan. I flew to Japan to speak firsthand with an indigenous group who has a similar history to Black Americans, just on the opposite side of the world. Step into the Ainu world with me.
Can you both tell me a little bit what it's like being an Ainu woman?
この世の中にはね、男性女性またねいろんな人たちもおりますけれども、もともとからアイヌ民族の昔の暮らしの中では狩猟採集交易の民でしたから、本当に対等な関係があったと思うんですけれども、日本社会になってやっぱり農耕民族の影響を受けて、そしてまた日本社会の中の家父長制度とか男尊女卑というようなそういった女性を低く見るというか卑しめるというか、そういう風潮が社会の中家庭の中に入ってきたことによって、またアイヌ女性はいろんな状況、大変な状況を今まで歩んできています。
ガイド独自のアイヌ民族の実態調査という調査がありまして、その調査の中でも、アイヌ民族は、 収入が低いとか教育が低いっていう結果が出ているんですが、そんな中でもアイヌ女性に関して特に男性よりもまだ、低いという結果が出てます。で、識字問題、読み書きができないとか、学校教育が低いという学校に行けてないという結果が出ているって、そういう面からも女性の困難というところがあります。
Later, but she mentioned something really interesting, or you mentioned something really interesting, which was before traditional Japanese, or I guess mainstream Japanese culture was brought in and kind of like took over Ainu culture. You mentioned that it brought in an element of misogyny and kind of like machismo that wasn't there prior. I'm just curious, what is the role of the women within the Ainu organization or within the Ainu community, as far as like a matriarchy or as far as just like power roles, gender roles currently today?
アイヌ社会が母系社会だったかというのは、はっきりしたことはわかりませんけれども、いわゆる狩猟採集民族は、それぞれ役割分担があって、男性は、大きな動物を取るとか、すると思いますね。で、女性はやっぱり、野山で山菜を取ったり、いろんなことをしていく上で、やっぱりその食料を確保する上で、もう対等な感じになっていくと思います。で、いろんな意味で女性は、いろんな交易にももちろん参加していたし、古い時代はもう戦いにも全部ではないですけれども、勇敢に参加していたという、記録も残っています。だから、本当に、ほぼ対等に、そういう生活をしていたんではないかなと思いますね。で、もう一つは、日本社会からいろんなそういう慣習が入ってきたばかりじゃなくて、アイヌ民族全体が日本社会の同化政策の中でアイヌ民族全体が困難な状況に陥っていった中に、さらに女性としての様々なそういう社会の一般の女性たちもそうであるように、アイヌ民族であることによっていろんなことを、制約されたり搾取されたりしていく中で、また女性はまた女性としての一般にあるような差別も一緒になっていわゆる複合的な交差的な差別の中で、今現在のアイヌ女性は困難な状況を歩んでいると思っています。
アイヌ女性の困難で言うと、タリアさんもすごく彫りが深くって綺麗な顔立ちですが、アイヌ女性も一般的な和人と呼ばれる人から見ると、すごく身体的特徴があって顔が彫りが深いとか、それでアイヌ女性特有の体の、作りが、他の人と違ったりして、すごくそこで差別を受けたりする。ですからなんていうんですか、私たちは美容の方にもすごくお金がかかるっていうか、それを避けるためにいろんなことをしてきて、本当に、和人には思えない私たち特有の悩みというのがあって、そこもアイヌ女性は悩みの一つであります。結婚問題、 男性女性の交際に関しても、すごく、配慮しながら、私たち後々の子孫のことも考えて、結婚するとかそういう悩みも持っています。
最初からお願いします。
じゃあ、ここ、知性を尋ねますけれども、入る前に自分が来たことを中の人に知らせるために。はい、そうです。じゃあ、できますね。
So growing up as a child, how were you treated by other children in school, whether it be middle school, high school, for being of Ainu heritage? And if you want to share or feel comfortable sharing any particular stories.
私の両親が、両親の母親、お互いの母親がアイヌ女性だったので、やっぱりそのアイヌ家庭に育ったことによって、両親たちはさまざまな差別経験をして、差別を受ける経験をしてきたので、その話をよく私たちにしてくれるすることと、それから父や母の兄弟たちが集まると、そのアイヌ差別をされて辛かったことをいつも話をすることを聞いていて、それが辛く悲しかったし、アイヌというものはそういうものなんだなっていうのを小さい頃から感じていました。
In the northmost reaches of the Japanese archipelago, an indigenous people called the Ainu have lived for centuries, holding fast to a rich culture unlike any other in Japan. Long before the modern state drew its borders, the Ainu thrived in what is now Hokkaido, which was once known as Izo, southern Sakhalin, and the Kuro Islands. They were hunter-gatherers and fishers, revering nature through animist beliefs and oral traditions passed down through generation. But as Japanese imperial ambitions grew, the Ainu homeland became the target of a relentless campaign of colonialization and assimilation. In 1869, the new Meiji government annexed Ainu territory, renaming Izo as Hokkaido and declaring it terra nullius, which means empty land, despite the Ainu living there for millennia and centuries. What followed was a concerted effort to just completely erase the Ainu identity. The government forbade the Ainu language in schools and public life, outlawed traditional customs like tattooing, and banned vital subsistence such as salmon fishing and deer hunting. Under this act, Ainu people were designated as former Aborigines, which effectively marked them as a people.
Definitely, and it sounds very cyclical in nature. So I can see how it can cause and lead to generational trauma if one generation is unable to find jobs and build security and stability, and that's then passed down to their children. And, the same struggles that come with poverty, like you mentioned, lack of education, is also passed down as well. So I guess in that same nature, we spoke a lot about the modern problems and the modern issues that a lot of Ainu people are facing today. But I would love if you could share a little bit about the history of the Ainu people in Japan and, both positive and, some of the other history that they experienced as well.
和人が北海道に入ってきたのはね、長い歴史の中で、流刑の地だったりもすることもありますし、一番あれなのは、いわゆる江戸時代に、松前藩っていう北海道の今の函館の近くに藩がっていうのは日本中にこう何々藩何藩ってありましたけど、松前藩があった時にいわゆる松前はお米が取れなかった北海道だから取れなかったからね、家臣たちに場所って言って北海道のいろんな海岸のあたりを場所を与えて、そこで海産物を取ってですね、それをこう、アイヌと交易をしてそれを上に上納するっていうことをしてたんですけど、そのうちにそこの場所でアイヌとかを使ってニシンカスというニシンの肥料を作ってたくさん本州に持ってそこでこうアイヌをものすごい奴隷的に使った期間があるんですよね。それはものすごい過酷なもので、もう男性も女性も働ける人はほとんどそこへ何年も使われたというそこのもう悲惨な歴史、そこの男性はもうそうだし女性はいわゆるその和人の人たちのいわゆる妻だとか妾とかっていういわゆる慰め者になったというそういった厳しい、歴史もまず一つはありますね。
Do you feel like that discrimination kind of evolves over time? So, going from middle school to high school and then entering the workforce, what sort of challenges do Ainu people face as they're trying to, enter into 9-to-5s? Is it hard for them to find employment in, a country that is heavily discriminatory?
私が直接差別をあまり受けたことないと言ったのは、私の住んでいた地域がアイヌの人数が多かったし、アイヌの有力者がいたおかげで、そういった直接的なアイヌいじめとか差別はあまりはなかったんですけど、ただ自分が差別をされる対象だっていうことはもうすごく認識していましたから、でちょっと一つエピソードなんですけれども、小学校の時に自宅から学校へ行くのがすごく遠かったんですよ。 その時に兄だけが自転車を持っていて、で私たちのランドセルをこの自転車のハンドルとかにかけて積んでくれて、そこを私たちが一緒にこう走って学校へ行くんですね。だから自然とすごくこう走ることが速くなったり、そういう面でも運動能力がすごくあったんですけど、そのことで中学校だとか高校に行った時にものすごくマラソン長距離が私速かったんです。だからクラブのところからもお誘いが来たんですね。でクラブに入って走ってちょうだい。多分走ったらものすごく高校へ行った時も最初は遊びながらゆっくり走ったのがもう20キロのところあっという間に3位に入ったくらいだから、黙って走ってれば1位になったかもしれないんだけど、なぜそれに入れなかったかというとアイヌの身体的特徴と言っていいのかよくわからない、ちょっと毛深さが私たちのこうすごくこうネガティブな部分で恥ずかしいと思う部分なので、ね、そこに入るとその体操着を着なきゃならないということで、そういったことがもう嫌でそのクラブに入ることができなかったので、もうそれがなければ違うことで活躍できたんだろうな、そういう話は私もそうですけども多くの仲間たちもそんな話をよくしますね。
です。はい。
先ほど三野さんも言いましたけどアイヌ民族にとってやっぱりその身体的特徴の彫りが深いっていうか眉毛が濃いとか、目がパッチリとかいろんなものがあって、そこから区別されて差別をされる時もありますけれども、もういわゆるその毛深いということがすごいこうネガティブなものになっていくんですよね。それはほとんどの人が経験しているし、私のおばたちもいつもその辛さを言ってました。で、私がその経験があるのは中学生の時に学校の中で大きなその体育祭かなんかがあって、昔はどうしてもこの体育着として短い短パンかなんかを履かなきゃならないんですよね。そうするとその足を出さなきゃならない時にやっぱりその体毛の濃い女性が同級生だったんですけれども全く先生が配慮しなかったから、もうそれを履かなかったら出られない。で、どうしても嫌な人は学校をその時休んでしまうとかするんですけど、彼女は真面目に来たんだけれど、やっぱりみんなのこう視線がもう辛かったんでしょう。もう本当になんとか足を隠そうとして、こうもじもじと手でこう隠す、仕草をずっとしてたんですよね。その時本当に自分もそういう毛深さとかっていうことを人前にさらすことがもう恥ずかしくて辛くてしょうがない時に、彼女のその行為が本当にその時の後からになってもどんな気持ちだったのかな、どんなに辛かったのかなっていうのがもう何十年経っても忘れることができないし、なんとか彼女をかばうこともできなかったのかなっていうことが今でもねすごい辛い。その違いを差別的に侮蔑的に指摘されるっていうその怖さっていうか、それが一番。
So your experience sounds really similar to the Black experience in the States. Particularly with Black women, we have a term called misogynoir. which is basically a hyphenated term for misogyny mixed with racism. So Black women experience both racism and, sexism at the same time. And it sounds like the Ainu's women's struggle is very similar in a sense, where you're experiencing racism and anti-Ainu hate, but you're also experiencing, sexism and the male gaze and those sort of flares that you described as people criticizing your friend's leg hair and kind of like placing that male gaze upon her. Sounds very similar. And I'm just curious what your opinion is on Ainu women having to fight two battles at one against racism and sexism at the same time.
はい。先ほど言ったような、体毛の問題とかは、やっぱりこう、同化政策の結果、様々な生活様式が変わって
こんな衣装を着ていれ
いったか
ば
ら、
腕を出したりとか足を出したりとかする必要もないけれども、日本の中で欧米化された生活様式だとノースリーブを着たりストッキングを履いたり、学校行くときはね、学校の、運動着はそんなものとかって決められてしまうと、やはりそこでそういうもうね、ネガティブにそういう差別的にそのことについて指摘されることもあるんですけども、まあそういった中でもやっぱりその民族の違いを尊重していけば、きちんとそういったこの民族はこういうね文化を持ったり、こういう特徴を持った民族、日本の人はこうだっていうことをしっかりお互い分かっていけば、それを差別的に指摘することはなかったと思うけれども、それをしてこなかったのかなっていうふうには一つは思います。
Traditional hunting and fishing were criminalized. Ainu children were compelled into Japanese-only schooling, and families were pressured to abandon Ainu names and adopt Japanese ones. The impact on Ainu society was catastrophic. Disposed of their lands and livelihood, many communities fell into poverty and despair. With no access to adequate healthcare or support, it introduced diseases like tuberculosis that swept through Ainu villages unchecked, causing staggering mortality. In some areas, nearly half of recorded Ainu deaths were from TB, compared to just 7.5% for the Japanese population. Entire Ainu settlements collapsed under the weight of famine, illness, and state-sanctioned violence. Historical records describe how within a generation of colonization, just one generation alone, Ainu communities suffered mass fatalities. Some observers likened it to the fate of other indigenous peoples discriminated by settler exploitation, which is true. Japanese forces and colonialists perpetuated atrocities against those who resisted. Notable Ainu revolts were brutally crushed, quite literally brutally forced into servitude. By the early 20th century, the Ainu had been reduced to a minority in their own homeland and were often regarded by the state as a, quote, dying race, to be assimilated or erased. This campaign of cultural suppression, which included a wide variety of tactics, some of them being banning language, spiritual practices, and even the Ainu way of life, amounts to what everybody, not just scholars and not just indigenous rights and advocates, but just anybody with eyes can see, was just a straightforward cultural genocide. It was an attempt not only to dominate the Ainu, but to extinguish them as a distinct people. Yet even under the suppression, the Ainu resisted in quiet ways, holding on to fragments of their.
Yeah, it sounds kind of like 40 acres and a mule law. So in the States, after slavery was abolished, Black people were promised 40 acres and a mule. It was promised land as well as a mule, but nobody ended up getting that. And there was discussion for reparations as well, but that wasn't something that was given by the government. But there was also a lot of like PR stunts, like you mentioned, that kind of made it seem like, slavery had been fully abolished, when in actuality, many people were still enslaved and didn't have land to move off of the plantation. So it sounds like a similar situation. And I think that kind of brings me to my next question, because in that process, we lost a lot of our culture, like oral traditions and things like that. And I know that Ainu people also speak a lot about losing or feeling like the language is disappearing. So I'm just curious if you could tell me how Ainu people are working to keep that language alive and pass it down amongst others. Is it orally? Is it written? What is kind of the form that it's being taught to the next generation?
アイヌの言葉について言えば、もともとはアイヌは文字を持っていなかったので、口伝えだけだったんですけれども、まあこのアイヌ語じゃなくて日本語を奨励されるようになってきたので、だんだん家庭でもそれがなくなり、学校では全く教えないので、だんだんそのアイヌ語も消滅をして伝わらなくなって、まあいわゆる日本人の学者の人たちはそのアイヌ語をアイヌから聞き取って研究所に残したり本に残したりとかで、そういうもので残ってるものはあるんですけれども、一般の家庭の中でとかほとんどそのアイヌ語も使われなくなって伝承もされなくなってきている。だから今現在はほとんどアイヌ民族でこう流暢にっていうか会話を流暢にできる人ってもうほとんどいないと思うぐらいですね。で、できるとすればテキストで学んだり何か本を読んだり教室へ行って習うという感じで、だから今ユネスコで消滅言語っていうのはアイヌ語が挙げられているくらい厳しい状況です。
Traditionally, before the assimilation laws,
そうですね。教室で教えてはいるけどテキストを使って教えるっていうか。
Those in front of us. Do you mind just explaining the cultural significance that food has to the Ainu people, and if there's any traditional meals that really mean a lot to the community?
この人にとっても大切だと思うんですよね。やっぱり食べることで命をつないでいくものですから、食べることをなくしてそういう生命は維持していけないわけですから、とても大事ですね。それにアイヌは自然界、春夏秋冬それぞれの自然界からいただくということがもういわゆる自然感謝していただく。で、自然界からずっと続けて私たちに供給される。私たちばかりじゃなく動物も全てがその自然界からものをいただくっていう考え方ですよね。で、そういった自然界に対する感謝の気持ちがやっぱり一番アイヌにとって大事ですけど、アイヌ以外の人たちも何か今はお店に行けばあるとか加工品があるっていうことで自然界からいただくっていう気持ち多分忘れてしまってると思うけれども、本当に誰にとっても大事だと思いますし、また特に特別なというとアイヌは先祖を大事にしたりとかしますから、たくさんのものが集まった時に先祖供養をするということがあるそうです。ものがたくさん集まって、じゃあ先祖に備えようっていう気持ちで表すって聞いてますから、本当に自然界からずっといただけるようにやっぱ自然界を汚さない、傷めない傷つけないっていう気持ちが 私たちにとってもみんなにとっても大事じゃないかなっていうふうに思っています。
So food is definitely one aspect that brings people together, but I would say spirituality is as well. Are there any Ainu spiritual beliefs or practices that are still in tradition today?
今現代も、伝わるアイヌの伝統的なそうですねスピリチュアルなちょっと信仰の部分の、ような伝統的な儀式でしたりとかしきたりでしたりといったものは、ございますでしょうか？
今もですね私たちはその先祖がさまざまな時に新年を迎える時にその今年もまた良い年でありますようにって祈る儀式だとかたくさん作物とかがいただけますようにとか、それから秋になって鮭が帰ってくる時にもですね川をきれいにしたりいろんなことをしてまたたくさん迎えるっていうそういう気持ちはもうそうですね。だからあと山へ行って木をこういった材料のために木をもらう時も必ずこれからこういったことに使う木をいただきますよっていう感謝と祈りをするっていう、全てにおいて自然界からに対しての感謝の気持ちはいろんなところである。それは多分アイヌが近年までずっとそういう持ってきたことだろうと思うけども、人類はやっぱりもうどの人たちもみんなそういう思いが多分必要なんだと思うね。例えばこのスマホを持っててもこんなに便利なものないですよね。もう話もできたり文章を書いて送ったり映像を撮ったりもうさまざまなことできる。この人間が作ったものにも魂があるっていうのは、これも料理をするときに私たちにね本当にうまく使わせてくれるとか煮炊きをする時もそうだって、だからどういったものにも魂があるっていうことは誰もがやっぱり必要だし、こういう切るものもこれがあるから高くしていられるっていう、全てのものに感謝するっていう気持ちが大事。アイヌは特に近年まで全てのものに魂がある。その魂に感謝する。その役目が終わったら感謝の気持ちで送るという、そういったのはずっと伝わってきています。
And another thing that I have found since being here is that
have us assimilate as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I think we spoke a lot about sort of the body shaming and the social aspects that come with being Ainu in Japan and experiencing that. But what are the legal, what is the legal playing field like for Ainu people? Do you feel like there are proper laws in place that are protecting Ainu people? So outside of social, what does the legal sphere look like?
差別って新しいアイヌの法律ができましたけれども、いわゆるこのアイヌが今まで暮らしてきた生活文化を発展させるとか、それからそしてそういったものを一般の人たちに理解してもらって、その文化の素晴らしさを理解してもらって、その上で差別もしないようにしましょうねということで、きちんとそのアイヌの人権を保障したりとか、それからそのアイヌが昔 もともとやってた生活文化を保障するというものではないですね。
What human rights would you say Ainu people are currently battling right now as of today?
人権というとなんかいろんな差別的な行為だけのような感じをしますけれども、アイヌ民族がね、もう150年前にさまざまな文化を否定され、言葉を日本語に奨励されたり、それから狩猟採集民族だったのが農業を奨励されたり、さまざまにこういう生活が変えられてきたことが来たわけですよね。でそこの中で今ほとんど人数も少なく日本社会に組み込まれている中で、そこの日本社会の中の教育に対してもきちんとアイヌに対して教育を受けさせてこなかった。教育を受けないことによって雇用に結びつかないことが社会保障からも外れていくとか、そういったもう悪いスパイラルから抜け出すことできないから、本当にそのことが今いる私たちの一般との格差、教育のレベルが低いだとか、それから収入が低いとか、それから生活環境がもう低いっていうことは実態調査で明らかですからね。その格差こそがもう人権侵害であるし差別的な状況に置かれてるっていうふうに私は思っています。
はい、アイヌの言葉について言えば、もともとはアイヌは文字を持っていなかったので、口伝えだけだったんですけれども、このアイヌ語じゃなくて日本語を奨励されるようになってきたので、だんだん家庭でもそれがなくなり、学校では全く教えないので、だんだんアイヌ語も消滅をして伝わらなくなった。いわゆる日本人の学者の人たちは、アイヌ語を、アイヌから聞き取って、研究所に残したり、本に残したりとか、で、そういうもので残ってるものはあるんですけれども、一般の家庭の中でとかほとんどアイヌ語も使われなくなって伝承もされなくなってきている。だから今現在は、ほとんど、アイヌ民族で、流暢にっていうか、会話を流暢にできる人ってもうほとんどいないと思うぐらいですね。で、できるとすれば、テキストで学んだり、何か本を読んだり、教室へ行って習うという感じで、だから、今、ユネスコで、消滅言語っていうのはアイヌ語が挙げられているくらい、厳しい状況です。
Through the late 19th and early 20th century, a few Ainu voices began to speak out. Shigeru Kayano, born in 1926, grew up hearing the old stories from his elders and witnessing the pain of Ainu marginalization. Determined to preserve his heritage, Kayano collected thousands of Ainu folklore pieces and artifacts, eventually founding a small Ainu museum in his village. Against all odds, he and others like him kept the flame of Ainu identity alive through Japan's darkest eras of repression. Now, if we fast forward to modern day, Japan's official policies of forced assimilation may have seemingly ended in the 20th century, but for the Ainu people, the legacy of the oppression is still felt every day. In modern times, the Ainu continue to face stark disparities and discrimination that set them apart from the wider Japanese society. My investigation finds that in 2025, well over a century since colonization, the Ainu are still fighting for basic equality in their own land. Despite some improvements, economic marginalization of the Ainu community remains a serious issue. By almost every metric of prosperity, income, employment, or education, Ainu people lag behind national averages due to the historical injustices and ongoing battle. Ainu households were significantly less on average than their non-Indigenous counterparts. Estimates indicate that Ainu annual income remained about 25% lower than the Japanese national average, reflecting higher rates of poverty and limited job opportunities. Unemployment and underemployment are common in the Ainu majority areas, as decades of exclusion have left many trapped in low-wage sectors. Even talented Ainu professionals can hit invisible barriers. Some report that employers quietly shun Ainu jobs once their background becomes known. Higher education, a pathway to better jobs, also sees a huge gap and disparity. College enrollment rates for Ainu youth are around 12% lower than the general populations, and this is all systematically and strategically done. These figures aren't mere statistics. They represent thousands of Ainu individuals who are systematically left behind, struggling to make a living in an economy that too often views them as second-class citizens. Underlying these economic challenges is a pattern of workplace and societal discrimination that Ainu people still encounter today. Many Ainu feel pressure to hide their identity in everyday life or fear of prejudice. If we disclose ourselves as Ainu when we seek a job, we are refused, says Sugumi Matsudaira, a young Ainu musician describing a reality that many people face. She notes that Ainu individuals have been rejected as marriage partners once the family learned of their heritage. A chilling reminder that racist stereotypes about the Ainu have deep roots. Stereotypes about the Ainu have very deep roots. They've been derided by some in mainstream society as, quote, uncivilized or backwards, and these harmful tropes are largely just born out of colonial propaganda that astonishingly still lingers in the current popular imagination. Older Ainu people recall how their parents and grandparents would conceal their ancestry, dreading the day their children might be taunted as a, quote, dirty Ainu, which is a common quote that was used against Ainu people by their classmates or neighbors. This internalized fear speaks to generations of shame and trauma that are inflicted on the community. In public life, open discrimination has often at times flared into just straight up hate speech. Human rights groups have documented an alarming uptick in hateful rhetoric targeting Ainu and other minorities in Japan, from online slurs to nationalist demonstrations denying the Ainu's existence. Government responses have been slow and inadequate, to say the least. And there's no comprehensive anti-discrimination laws in Japan that protect the Ainu from racial hate incidents, so there's not really any hate crime laws that protect the Ainu at the moment. As recently as the 2020s, far-right commentators and even politicians have openly belittled the Ainu. In one notorious case, a Diet member who had referred to Ainu as being, quote, no longer existing, faced virtually no repercussions, highlighting how deeply ingrained and institutionally tolerated anti-Ainu bias can be. The social struggles of the Ainu are compounded by a sense of erasure in Japan's mainstream culture and institutions. In school textbooks and national narratives, Ainu history has been glossed over or whitewashed.
So I think Japan has, in a sense, at least the government has tried to commodify a lot of Ainu culture to, gain profit and kind of bring in tourist dollars. They've invested billions of dollars in not just museums, but also theme parks, and there's also media such as, the Golden Kamuy show. I'm just curious if you feel like the government's depiction of Ainu people to foreign audiences and to tourists seems somewhat performative if the treatment is not, parallel to that.
ゴールデンカムイのようにアイヌの歴史や生活文化を表したのって今までなかったので、いわゆるもう多くの人たちがすごい注目をして、アイヌの歴史や文化本からそれからいろんなアニメから学んだっていうことは アイヌのことを多くの方が知ったということはまあすごくいいし、中身的にもきちんと監修されているので間違いではないから、それはそれでまあ良かったのかなっていうふうに思います。だけど一方もう一つ、この今いわゆる文化と言われて、アイヌ文化と言われているものが、アイヌが昔とにかくこういう地勢の中で家族が生活し、ね、何軒かあって集落があって、そこの中では一年中自分たちが食べる食料の確保だとか、それからこういう生活に使う道具だとか、家を建てるものの準備だとか、そういったことをしながら折々にアイヌの儀式をする時にお料理をたくさん作ったり踊ったり歌ったりするっていう、そういったものを全部ひっくるめてアイヌの生活が文化なんですね、生まれてから死ぬまで。そういったもののもっともっとその背景、自分たちの生活と自然界からこういった全てのものをいただいてくる背景、それから踊りをする儀式をする時は何のためにするのかっていうことをもっと私たちもこう文化を寸断されてきた当事者もそうですし、人に知らせる時にアイヌのいわゆるその生活というものは自然とともにこんな風にやってきたっていうことをしっかりと自分たちも学び、相手にも説明するような状況を作っていかなければなんか本当に少しずつ切り取った文化だけになってしまうかなっていう懸念があります。
Many Japanese citizens grew up with little to no education about the Ainu people, about the Ainu beyond perhaps a footnote about a quote people in Hokkaido. The omission is not accidental. It reflects a long-held state narrative that Japan is an ethnically homogeneous nation, a myth propagated at the highest level. In 1986, for example, Prime Minister Yasuhiro Nakasone infamously declared Japan a mono-ethnic country of no ethnic minorities, effectively writing the Ainu out of existence in official rhetoric. Although curricula have slowly begun to include Ainu culture in recent years, Ainu history is still often taught superficially without confronting the injustices they endured. As a result, generations of Japanese grew up unaware of the colonial violence inflicted on the Ainu. Young Ainu students rarely see their heritage respected or accurately represented in class. Testing. Okay. The societal struggles of the Ainu are compounded by a sense of erasure in Japan's mainstream culture and institutions. In school textbooks and national narratives, Ainu history has often been glossed over or whitewashed. Many Japanese citizens grew up with little to no education about the Ainu beyond perhaps a footnote about a people in Hokkaido. This omission is not accidental.
All of the Ainu clothes are so incredibly unique from each other, down to the stitching and the patterns. All of them are really beautiful in their own way. But I was just curious, what is the cultural significance of each of the patterns, if there is one, and also the significance of the tattoos that the women used to wear back in the days.
アイヌ衣装については昔は女性が夫だとか子供とかに作ってもともと渦巻きみたいな文様からこうイメージしてそれぞれ作っていきましたから、古いもので本当に同じものってなかなかないんですよね。今近年になってこういうものが 写真集になったりすると、それを復元すれば同じものもあるけど、昔のものでほとんど同じものない、その母親が作って、またその作り方を娘に伝えていくっていうことで、多分違うものもないし、本当にそれぞれの地方によってこのような文様は日高地方だったりとか、こういう私が着てるようなのは白老地方だったりとかって地方によって違ったりしますけど、文様それぞれの意味はもう昔からそんなふうに意味があったのかどうかわからないけれども、例えば文様を施すのにはこの襟のあたり、袖口に裾にっていうところから間が入らないように置いたと、配置したというも言われてもいますし、あとこういうところにあるトゲもその間というのはやっぱりその病気であったり怪我であったり、そういうね、私たちが好まないものが来ないように、そういったものが来ないようにというので威嚇をするという意味もあったとも言われていますけれども、それが確かなことかどうかまでははっきりはちょっとわからないですね。もう一つ何でした？入れずにね、今日私もメイクでしてきましたけれども、私今日祖母の写真を持ってきたんだよね。ちょっと見ます？
Yeah. Okay. Oh wow.
私の祖母の写真で、口の周り入れ墨してますし、手は見えないけど昔はここからここまで入れ墨ありましたね。似てますか？
You guys look so like just alike. Yes, just alike.
よく似てるって言われるんですけど。
You have the same face. So pretty.
すごく気高い雰囲気をまとった女性で、とても綺麗な方です。優しそうな笑顔ですね。
もう本当に私の母は嫁だったけれども、本当に優しかったって言ってました。で、いつ頃からこの入れ墨を始めたかはわからないんですけれども、よくこう文献に書かれてるのはこう、そういう成人に立派な女性として成人になるようにっていうことで、その年齢が近づくとだんだん入れ墨をしていったというふうにも言われている。もう一つ一方、これ正しいかどうかわからないんですけれども、たくさん和人の人が入ってくるようになった時に何か悪さされないようなための、余計そういったためにされたんで、それははっきりしたそれもわからないですけれども、これも明治の5年に入れ墨っていうのは野蛮な行為だっていうことで禁止をされたんですね。いろんなもの禁止されたけども、例えば男性もこういう耳イヤリング昔からしてたんですけれども、うちの祖母もしてます。
Oh yeah, she has like the same hoop earrings. Yeah.
ですから私もこんな風にしてきましたけれども、そんなので意味があったか、だから私も やろうかなと思って。
So, in addition to the tattoos, like the traditional tattoos that your grandmother passed along the information to, did she ever pass along information about what sort of dances, if dancing was something that brought the community together, or if it was something that, you know, she instilled and kind of like passed down to her family?
そうですね。おばあ様から、伝わっている伝統的な、踊りですとか歌ですとか物語ですとかといったようなものはございますでしょうか。
この祖母が私が2歳の時に亡くなってるので、ほとんど祖母からはそういったものを教わっていないんですけれども、だけど2歳の時の祖母の記憶があるんですよ。私は祖母にちょうど今よりも1ヶ月くらい前ぐらいの時に外に連れて行っていただいて、お茶に漢方薬にするようなセタエントというのがあるんですね。でもう立ち枯れていて、まだ雪が残ったところに立ち枯れてるものを取ってきておかゆに入れて体悪い時に食べるという、その独特の匂い香りが記憶にあったから私覚えているのかもしれないんだけど、今私もアイヌのその伝統的な食材を使って少しでもその環境と食を考えることをしようかなと思っているのは、多分この祖母のそういった記憶があることと、でこの祖母が作った衣装が祖母の妹が嫁いでたところで持ってたんですよね。それで今私のところに戻ってきているっていう祖母が塗ったものがですね、もう100年以上前になるもの、本当に不思議で何十年もわからないでいたのに、そこでもうねいらなくなったって言って時に祖母が作ったんだっていうのが分かって私のところにあるので、本当にそういうものが
effectively writing the Ainu out of existence in official rhetoric. Although curricula have slowly begun to include Ainu culture in recent years, Ainu history is still often taught superficially, without confronting the injustices they endure. As a result, generations of Japanese grow up unaware of the colonial violence inflicted on the Ainu, and young Ainu students rarely see their heritage respected or accurately represented in classroom materials. There's also a lack of Ainu representation in media and politics. Ainu characters or themes occasionally appear in popular media, for instance, the hit anime Golden Kamuy features Ainu protagonists, but even these are double-edged. In a recent film adaptation, the lead Ainu character was portrayed by non-Ainu actresses, a decision that sparked debate about cultural appropriation and the exclusion of Ainu voices from media that even represent them, from media that is supposedly meant to center them. Such casting choices exemplify how Ainu people are still often regulated to the sidelines, even in stories about themselves. In national politics, the situation is similarly stark. Only a handful of individuals of Ainu heritage have ever held seats in Japan's parliament or local assemblies. The consequences is that policy decisions about Ainu affairs are usually made without direct Ainu input, perpetuating feelings of powerlessness, and invisibility. These social and economic inequalities also translate into educational and health disparities. Historically, Ainu children had far less access to quality schooling, a legacy of poverty and past segregation that the community is still working to overcome. While former barriers have been lifted, subtle hurdles remain. There are few, if any, Ainu language or culture programs integrated into the standard school system. Ainu language classes, for example, are often available only through special workshops or community efforts, not as part of regular curricula. This means Ainu youth seldom receive affirmation of their identity in the education system, and all students in Japan miss the chance to learn the true history of their indigenous peers. The lack of culturally relevant education not only harms Ainu students' self-esteem, but also allows historical whitewashing to persist unchallenged. Meanwhile, the intergenerational trauma from decades of colonization and forced assimilation manifests in health issues. Community leaders report that Ainu people face disproportionate levels of stress, depression, and other mental health challenges. Community leaders report that Ainu people face disproportionate levels of stress, depression, and other mental health challenges, much of it linked to the lingering effects of historical trauma and societal discrimination. During my investigation, I found that there were some Ainu elders who described seeing patterns of alcohol abuse and suicide in some families, tragedies he directly attributes to the loss of cultural identity, continued marginalization, and being trapped within a system that creates these conditions. Access to healthcare is another concern. Rural Ainu communities in Hokkaido often have limited medical facilities, and discrimination can deter some from seeking care. In some cases, Ainu patients have recounted discriminatory treatment by healthcare staff once their ethnicity was known, that an indignity that further alienates people from public service that should serve everyone equally. While quantitative data on Ainu people's disparity is scarce, in part due to the government's past reluctance to even acknowledge ethnic differences, the qualitative evidence of unmet needs and unequal outcomes is compelling. Simply put, the Ainu people as a group endure poor health, both physical and mental, as an outgrowth of the poverty and prejudice they contend with. In 2023, being Ainu in Japan means living with a dual reality. On paper, you are an equal citizen of a prosperous nation, yet in daily life you carry the weight of historic injustice. The community's socioeconomic struggles, lower income, fewer opportunities, and enduring bigotry are not relics of the past, but ongoing fronts in the fight for equality. Modern Japan's image as a harmonious, homogeneous society has often been built by ignoring the voices of Ainu people. As my investigation reveals, the cost of that silence is measured in unequal livelihoods, muted identities, and lives cut short. After generations of campaigning by Ainu activists, the Japanese government has in recent data begun to acknowledge the Ainu people. How meaningful is that recognition? In this section, we delve into the legal and political battles that have defined the Ainu's quest for justice, and reveal how, despite new laws and official statements, true equality under the law remains elusive. For most of Japan's modern history, the Ainu were effectively written out of the nation's legal framework. The 1989 Protection Act had turned them into former Aborigines, and therefore the government acted as if the Ainu problem had been solved through assimilation. It wasn't until 1997, nearly a century later, that a significant change occurred. In response to relentless pressure from Ainu activists and a landmark court case, Japan enacted the first law aimed at preserving Ainu culture rather than obliterating it. This came on the heels of the Nubutani Dam case, in which a court ruled that the government had unlawfully ignored Ainu cultural rights when seizing land for a dam project. In 1997, law known as the Ainu Cultural Promotion Act replaced the old assimilationist law and was heralded as a new beginning. It provided modest funding for Ainu language classes, cultural events, and the establishment of a foundation to research Ainu traditions. Symbolically, it marked the first time the Japanese state officially acknowledged the existence of Ainu culture worth protecting. However, the law poignantly avoided recognizing any indigenous rights or addressing past wrongs. It focused solely on culture and not on land, resources, or self-determination. Many observers noted that this cultural promotion was a far cry from genuine equality. It was a carefully limited concession that left the core issues of Ainu land rights and political status untouched. In January 2008, under international pressure and on the eve of hosting a G8 summit in Hokkaido, Japan's parliament finally issued a resolution formally recognizing the Ainu as an indigenous people of Japan. This was a momentous symbolic victory. After decades of the government refusing to use the term indigenous, suddenly the Ainu were acknowledged as the original inhabitants of Hokkaido, with a quote, distinct language, religion, and culture. Ainu communities welcomed the statement as an overdue validation of their identity. Yet tellingly, the resolution carried no legal force. It was a statement of recognition without any concrete rights attached. What did it mean to be recognized as indigenous in Japan? The question remained unanswered in law. Over the next decade, communities and that question remained unanswered in the courts of law. Over the next decade, communities and panels convened to discuss Ainu policy. Ainu representatives participated but felt the process was very much top-down. The government would listen, then decide on its own terms, only offering a listening ear but not actually taking any input. Eventually, the discussions accumulated in a new piece of legislation, the Ainu Policy Promotion Act of 2019, also referred to simply as the Ainu Promotion Act. Passed in the Diet, this law was touted by the government as a milestone addressing Ainu issues in a comprehensive way. The 2019 Ainu Promotion Act for the first time explicitly recognized the Ainu in Japan's law as an indigenous people and included language prohibitions and discrimination against them. It also promised financial support for uplifting Ainu culture and public awareness, including the establishment of a national Ainu museum and park called Upopoi, which opened in Hokkaido in 2020 as a center for Ainu cultural revival. This is where my interview takes place today and where I traveled in Japan. On paper, this act seems to signal a new era. Government press releases spoke of ending decades of discrimination and reviving Ainu traditions. International media initially praised Japan for finally empowering the Ainu. But on the ground in Hokkaido, many Ainu greeted the new law with skepticism and with incredibly minimal input from Ainu communities, and that it contains no provisions to restore Ainu land rights or guarantee self-determination. Instead, the law centers on funding cultural projects and tourism development. One Ainu elder, upon seeing the fanfare around the law's passage, bitterly remarked that it felt like, quote, the latest incarnation of over a century of colonial rule, dressed up in benevolent language. Quote, I do not want each Ainu to become a walking tourist banner, warned Shinzu Yuji, an Ainu leader, criticizing the law's heavy emphasis on turning Ainu culture into a showcase while sidestepping demands for autonomy. Through my investigation, I found that these critiques are widely shared among Ainu rights advocates. The Ainu Promotion Act fails to address the systemic injustices that underpin the Ainu's marginalization. It offers no redress for the land stolen through colonialization, no community control over natural resources, and no mechanism for political representation. As one analysis notes, the 2019 law, quote, neither outlines collaboration with the Ainu nor guarantees that its policies will be implemented toward directly improving their lives and well-being, suggesting that without deeper change, it will, quote, change little for the Ainu themselves. In effect, the Act continues the pattern set in 1997. Government recognition of Ainu culture in form, but not a recognition of Ainu rights. For example, while the Act forbids discrimination, it sets out no specific penalties or enforcement bodies, leaving Ainu with little recourse when facing hate speech or systematic bias. Test. Similarly, though, it funds cultural programs. It places those funds largely in the hands of but it places those funds largely in the hands of local governments and state-applied council rather than under direct Ainu control or Ainu community control. Many municipalities have reportedly used Ainu promotion grants to build roadside cultural parks or renovate community centers without even consulting Ainu residents about their actual needs. Requests made by Ainu groups for more practical support, such as scholarships, improved housing, or healthcare services, are often sidestepped. As of 2023, no targeted scholarship or economic development programs exist under Japanese law to close the gap between Ainu and other citizens. The failure to include such measures in the Ainu Promotion Act is glaring, given the known disparities such as income, education, and more that Ainu face. One of the most contentious omissions in Japan's Ainu policy is the matter of land and resource rights. Modern indigenous rights frameworks around the world recognize that indigenous people must have some control over their ancestral lands and natural resources to truly exercise their rights. Yet in Japan, the Ainu have zero legally recognized collective land rights. Not a single acre of Hokkaido has been returned or set aside for Ainu self-governance, and the government continues to treat all land and resources there as if the Ainu do not have special claim to them. The 2019 Act does nothing to change this and contains no provisions for land restitution or co-management of fosters, rivers, or wildlife. Consequently, Ainu communities remain unable to legally hunt or fish freely in the places that their ancestors did. They must adhere to the same strict regulations as any Japanese citizen, which often do not account for traditional subsistence needs. For instance, catching salmon in local rivers, a practice at the heart of Ainu culture, is largely prohibited by national law. Ainu fishers have to petition for one-time exceptions as, quote, cultural demonstrations, or go through arduous legal battles to secure limited rights. In one ongoing case, an Ainu group called the Raporo Ainu Nation filed a lawsuit in 2021 seeking recognition of their ancestral right to freely harvest salmon, arguing that Japan's denial of this right violates their indigenous rights under the international law. The government's response has been to fight the case in court, reflecting a reluctance to concede any special resource rights to the Ainu. Meanwhile, development projects on traditional Ainu lands continue with scant input from Ainu people. From dams and forestry to tourism infrastructure, the pattern of the state unilaterally managing Hokkaido land has not fundamentally changed since the 19th century. It's still a colonial paradigm. Critics say only now it is obscured by gestures of cultural recognition. Another overlooked issue is the handling of Ainu ancestral remains and sacred sites. During the colonial period, Ainu graves were desecrated and remains were taken, often by researchers in the late 19th and 20th centuries, for study, and it ended up being used in university collections. Ainu activists have long called for the return of their ancestors' bones for a proper reburial. The government did establish a facility at Upokoi to store, but controversy erupted over this approach. Many Ainu advocates felt it was essentially a warehouse controlled by the state, which it is. It's not a true reburial or honoring of the. Factually speaking, it's just yet another symbol of ongoing colonial attitudes. The state deciding how to curate Ainu heritage without relinquishing any control to the Ainu people. The Ainu Promotion Act mentions nothing about reparation or protecting sacred sites. It does not mandate the return of ancestral lands or graves, nor create legal obligations to consult Ainu communities when, say, a construction project might disturb a sacred landscape. This silence in the law is deafening to those who have fought for decades on these fronts. From a legal perspective, Japan's stance toward the Ainu can be summarized as recognition without rights. Yes, the Ainu are now officially called, quote, indigenous, and the government funds cultural showcases, but when it comes to substantive rights such as land ownership, self-governance, political representation, resource use, the Ainu have no more rights than they did under assimilation policy. An Ainu individual is treated in law just like any other Japanese citizen, which sounds equal on the surface, but really fails to account for the grossly unequal starting point created by centuries of oppression. As indigenous rights experts point out, formal equality can entrench injustice when one group has had everything stolen from them. Without special provisions to return what was taken or to empower the marginalized, recognition rings hollow. This is the crux of the Ainu's political struggle today. Pushing Japanese law and society to move beyond tokenism and finally address the Ainu as a people with collective rights. It's worth noting that the Japanese government often defends its actions by citing the Constitution's equality clause, suggesting that granting distinct rights to Ainu people might violate the principle that all citizens are equal. Ainu activists counters that true equality requires recognizing their distinct status. Otherwise, equality is just a pretext for continuing assimilation under a new guise. International human rights bodies tend to agree with the activists. Japan has been repeatedly urged by United Nations committees and other nations to strengthen the Ainu rights protection. During Japan's Universal Periodic Review at the UN Human Rights Council, multiple countries recommended that Japan adopt comprehensive anti-discrimination laws and guarantee Ainu land and resource rights in line with global standards. The Japanese state's response has been cautious and incremental. Officials often highlight what they have done, so like the 2019 law and the opening of Upopoi, discussion of land restitution or political power for Ainu. This, quote, politics of recognition gives the appearance of progress while maintaining the status quo of state control. As one critical analysis put it, the new Ainu policies, quote, merely reinforce constraints over Ainu self-discrimination and autonomy, functioning as a colonial system by other means. In sum, the legal struggle of the Ainu is far from over. They have achieved acknowledgement. The Ainu are no longer invisible in Japan's law as they once were. But that acknowledgement has yet to translate into the restoration of their inherent rights as an indigenous people. The Japanese government's current approach has been described as, quote, sympathy without justice. They are sympathetic words, even apologies for past mistreatment, and supportive gestures like cultural funding. But the fundamental structures of power and ownership in Hokkaido remain as they were established in the Meiji era, firmly in the hands of the state and ethnic Japanese interests. Changing that will require much stronger political will, legal reform, and perhaps international pressure, as I'll explore later in this report. Amid oppression, there is resilience. This section I want to shine a light on the Ainu resistance, the activists, the elders, and youth who refuse to let their culture die. It's a story of cultural revival against the odds of legal battles fought in courtrooms and speeches made on the world stage. It's a voice of the Ainu people themselves, rising in defiance and hope. The history of the Ainu resistance is as long as the history of their oppression. From the earliest days of Japanese encroachment, the Ainu fought back, sometimes through arms, as in Shakushin's War of 1969, when Ainu clans united against the Matsume domain, only to be betrayed and massacred, and sometimes through everyday acts of cultural defiance, likely secretly passing down prayer chants known as ikan and traditional embroidery motifs even when practices were outlawed. By the mid-20th century, open rebellion had given way to political organizing. In 1946, right after World War II, Ainu leaders formed the Ainu Association of Hokkaido, an organization dedicated to improving Ainu welfare and preserving their culture. This was a remarkable step. Under Japan's new constitution, which guaranteed equality, Ainu activists saw a chance to claim rights they had been denied. Figures like Shigeru Kayano, Mashiho Chiri, and others began to advocate for Ainu language education and the recording of folklore, fearing that without action their heritage would vanish. They also protest discriminatory treatment in local communities. Often they met with indifference or ridicule of authorities, but their persistence slowly built a movement. One of the pioneering activists, Shigeru Kayano, emerged as a symbol of Ainu resilience, seditious, at a time when doing so was even seen as backwards or even seditious. In the 1970s, he opened a small private Ainu museum in his hometown, creating a space where Ainu heritage could be celebrated by Ainus themselves. His efforts inspired pride in younger Ainu and curiosity amongst some Japanese. In 1994, Kayano achieved what would have seemed unimaginable decades earlier. He became the first Ainu ever to serve in Japan's parliament, winning a seat in the upper house. Standing on the floor of the Diet in traditional Ainu clothing, Kayano spoke in the Ainu language, an act of defiance and assertion of identity that made headlines. He used his position to demand official recognition of Ainu rights and was instrumental in the lead-up to the 1997 Cultural Promotion Act. Though some criticized the law's limitations, Kayano welcomed it as a starting point and famously said, "This is not the end of our struggle for recognition, but the beginning of a new chapter." His presence in the Diet was short. He only got the chance to serve one term, but it cracked the door open for Ainu issues in the national political conversation. A key aspect of Ainu resistance has been cultural issues in the national political conversation. Cultural revival. The understanding that reclaiming language, art, and spirituality itself is a form of political activism. From the 1980s onward, there was a coerced push by Ainu communities to revive what was nearly lost. Ainu language classes sprang up, often led by elders who were among the last fluent speakers. Traditional dances and ceremonies were reintroduced at festivals, and in 1984, the Ainu Association even proposed a new law that went beyond culture to call for rights. Among their demands were guaranteed seats for Ainu in parliament and anti-discrimination measures, land grants, and the recognition of traditional fishing and hunting rights. While the government did not adopt these proposals at the time, simply articulating them was empowering for the Ainu cultural movement. It was a declaration that they deserved not just cultural preservation, but a form of self-determination within Japan. International solidarity has also played a crucial role. Ainu activists reached out to global indigenous peoples movement, finding common cause with Native Americans, First Nations, Maori, Sami, and many others. In 1987, Ainu representatives participated for the first time in the United Nations Working Group on Indigenous Populations. There, they identified themselves proudly as an indigenous people of Japan and made their case to the world. They advocated for the term Ainu Minsoku, meaning the Ainu as a distinct people or nation to be recognized, explicitly invoking the right to self-determination. These efforts were transformative. Hearing the struggles of other indigenous groups and sharing their own gave Ainu activists new strategies and moral support. It also embarrassed the Japanese government, which preferred to keep its minority issues out of the international spotlight. The momentum from global forums contributed to the pressure that led Japan to finally acknowledge the Ainu as indigenous in 2008. When the UN adopted the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, known as UNDRIP, in 2007, which Japan voted for, it further legitimized Ainu claims. Activists could point out that under UNDRIP, Japan has obligations like respecting Ainu self-preservation and consulting them on any decision affecting their land. This gave the movement a powerful tool to hold Japan accountable on the world stage. On the cultural front, Ainu artists and scholars have been instrumental in breathing life back into tradition that were once suppressed. We spoke with young Ainu musicians who who blend ancient chants with modern genres. Ainu painters and woodcarvers whose work is gaining recognition, and language teachers devising new curricula for the next generation. Sutsugumi Matsudaira, the singer we met earlier, the singer who spoke openly in another interview. Okay, don't. This sense of pride is a marked change from the generation of Ainu grandparents, when identifying as Ainu was often a source of shame or danger. Across Hokkaido, Ainu cultural festivals have proliferated, from traditional Ainumate bear sending ceremonies performed again with proper respect, to annual events where Ainu drummers and dancers welcome visitors to experience their heritage on their terms, not as exotic exhibitions or fetishized exhibitions. Even beyond Japan's borders, Ainu culture is being shared. Exhibits like the 2023 Ainu Stories Contemporary Lives in London showcase Ainu life and history, curated in partnership with the Ainu from Sawa River region. These serve not just as education for outsiders, but as affirmation for the Ainu people that their culture matters and endures. Crucially, the Ainu people themselves are taking charge of these narratives. Ainu-led initiatives and organizations have multiplied. These are Ainu-run media projects like radio programs in the Ainu language and newsletter for dismantling community news. Youth organizations have formed, such as the Ainu Women's Association, which focuses on both gender and indigenous issues, acknowledging that Ainu women often face a double burden of discrimination. Activists like Kairoi Tahara, an Ainu scholar, emphasizes that while the government's recognition in 2019 was a victory, it is only one step. Our struggles are not over yet. We continue to face discrimination, and we are not yet free to celebrate our culture, speak the language, or reveal our distinct identity, Tahara says. She highlights how Ainu women in particular navigate both the patriarchal norms of Japanese society and certain patriarchal tendencies within Ainu communities, insisting on a more inclusive revival that empowers all Ainu. Some Ainu communities have pursued forms of self-organization akin to sovereignty on a small scale. For instance, in the town of Biratori, home of the late Shigeru Kayano, Ainu locals have been deeply involved in managing cultural resources and local museums. The aforementioned Rapporo Ainu Nation, though not recognized officially, operates as a sort of representative body for its members, asserting their rights via legal action and declarations. In 2023, Rapporo Ainu leaders issued the Rapporo Declaration, calling for unfettered access to land and resources as essential for Ainu cultural survival and demanding that the Japanese state honor their indigenous rights. This declaration is part of a wider push for what some describe as Ainu sovereignty, not independence from Japan, but autonomy in managing their affairs, lands, and development. Even within the framework of tourism, which many activists criticize, some Ainu have flipped the script by using tourism as a platform for education and self-resilience. For example, Ainu guides in certain villages now offer cultural immersion experiences that not only provide income, but also allow them to tell their history in their own words, often correcting misconceptions held by visitors. They are approaching themselves not as tourist Ainu, but as a cultural ambassador who ensure that the narrative is told truthfully, including the painful parts. Another significant aspect of Ainu resistance is the fight for restitution and memory. Activists like the late Kaizawa Tadashi fought tirelessly to reclaim Ainu remains from university vaults, successfully pressuring institutions like the Hokkaido University to return stolen bones for reburial in the 2010s. In one notable ceremony in 2017, Ainu elders finally laid to rest the skulls of dozens of their ancestors, more than a century after they were taken. Moment of somber triumph that underscore both the resilience of Ainu spirituality and the injustices they are still undoing. Campaigns are also ongoing to protect sacred sites. For instance, the site of the Battle of Samuksne, an important 17th century Ainu resistance site, is being advocated for as a memorial park. Young Ainu activists document these places and conduct oral history interviews with elders creating an archive of Ainu memory that will serve future generations. The cumulative effect of all these efforts is a cultural and political resurgence of the Ainu people. What was predicted by the 19th century anthropologists to be a vanishing culture is today very much alive. The Ainu language, which still in danger, now has hundreds of learners and a handful of second language speakers emerging from classes, something that hadn't happened for decades. UNESCO in 2009 recognized traditional Ainu dance as part of the world's intangible cultural heritage, acknowledging its significance and the community working to preserve it. Ainu youth are increasingly proud to identify themselves openly, a sea change from their grandparents who often were forced to keep silent. In 2020, for example, when an Ainu athlete lit the Olympic torch during a relay event, she did so wearing traditional Ainu attire, symbolizing to the world that the Ainu are still here, carrying the flame of their ancestors. Resistance for the Ainu has never been solely about opposing something. It's about asserting their right to exist as themselves. Every Ainu word spoken, every traditional song sung, every legal petition filed, and every protest staged is a declaration that we are still here. We have survived, and we will determine our own future. This spirit of self-determination is the thread that connects an elder like Shigeru Kayono to a young activist like Kaori Tahara, or a musician like Tsugumi Matsudaya. It is refusal to be erased and a demand for respect and justice that grows louder. We also examine how Japan's treatment of the Ainu measures up against international standards and agreements of international rights, of indigenous rights. Within Japan, the Ainu are not the only group with an indigenous claim. The Ryukyuan people of Okinawa are neighboring islands, also known as Uchinachu or Lewechuan, also known as Uchinanchu or Lewechuan people, have their own distinct culture and history of annexation by the Ryukyu Kingdom before being conquered and absorbed by Japan in the late 19th century, were an independent people, known as the Ryukyu Kingdom, before being conquered and absorbed by Japan in the late 19th century. They too faced policies aimed at assimilating them into the Japanese mold, including suppression of their language, known as Uchinaguchi, and cultural practices. And like Hokkaido, Okinawa was heavily militarized and colonialized. In Okinawa's case, it became host to massive U.S. military bases after World War II, often built on expropriated land. Despite these parallels, there is a stark difference in how Japan's official regards the Ryukyuans versus the Ainu. Japan does not recognize the Ryukyuans as an indigenous people, even as it is now, at least formally acknowledged. The lack of recognition means Ryukyuans do not benefit even from the limited legal protections of cultural promotion efforts available to the Ainu. Ryukyuan advocates have watched the Ainu's progress with a mix of solidarity and envy. In Okinawa, activists often cite the Ainu case when petitioning the Japanese government or the UN, arguing that the Ryukyuans too deserve acknowledgement as an indigenous with the intended rights that status entails. So far, however, the Japanese government has been resistant, likely due to political reasons. Recognizing Okinawa as Okinawans as indigenous could strengthen opposition to the unpopular U.S. bases and invite scrutiny of Japan's government, as it rightfully should. Both Ainu and Ryukyu communities continue to face discrimination. For example, stereotypes in mainland Japan paint Okinawans as lazy or backwards, much as Ainus were maligned, and both have seen their languages listed by the UNESCO as endangered. In essence, the Ainu and Ryukyu share a legacy of marginalizations under a nation state that until recently prided itself on homogeneity, and both are pushing back against that legacy. Looking globally, the story of Ainu resonates with the experiences of indigenous people on nearly every continent. These patterns of colonization and assimilation are strikingly similar. In the United States and Canada, for instance, indigenous nations were forced off their territories onto reservations, and their children taken to boarding schools where their language and cultures were viciously suppressed. Much as Ainu children were forbidden to speak Ainu and were drilled in Japanese etiquette in schools designed to, quote, civilize them. One could draw parallels between the Ainu and Indigenous people of Australia. The concept of treating Indigenous land as terra nullius, or, quote, nobody's land, to justify the taking is not unique to Japan. It was first used by European colonizers in the Americas, Australia, and Africa as well. Indeed, Japan's leaders during the Meiji era were keenly aware of Western colonial practices and explicitly emulated them. Hokkaido's colonization was driven by a desire to modernize along Western lines, including the subjugation of native people, which Western empires carried out. One could draw parallels between the Ainu and the Indigenous people of Australia. Both were hunting fishing societies on islands that industrial powers coveted. Both suffered population collapse due to disease and disposition, and both had their children and languages targeted for eradication. And for decades, both were regarded by their colonizers as primitive people destined to vanish. In Australia, both also experienced a cultural genocide. However, there's also notable differences in outcomes and current frameworks. Many countries of colonial histories have begun taking a thorough public reckoning of the treatment of the Ainu. There have been apologies in a broad sense. For example, when the 2019 law was passed, government officials made statements acknowledging that the Ainu were long oppressed, but nothing like an official apology or truth commission to document Ainu grievances. In terms of public consciousness, one might argue that the average Japanese citizen is still less aware of Ainu history This is partly due to Japan's education system, which, as noted, only slightly touches on Ainu issues, whereas Indigenous rights scholars often cite Japan as an example of recognition without right. A cautionary tale of a state appearing progressive by saying the right words, yet not enacting the substantive changes needed to fulfill those words, much like what the US, Australia, and many imperialist nations do. The Ainu's fight for justice is part of a broader global movement of Indigenous peoples striving to decolonize and to secure their rights. While context is deferred, the solidarity among these groups is powerful. Many Ainu see their struggle reflected in the stories of other Indigenous nations. They draw inspiration from, say, how the Maori regained official status of their land, or how the Lakota and the U.S. What does the future hold for the Ainu people? In this final section, we look ahead. The Ainu have survived, but true equality and justice remain goals on the horizon. We explore what changes are necessary to achieve those goals, from legal reforms in Tokyo to continued grassroots activism in Hokkaido, and how international pressure might play a role. These are not mere idealistic musings. They are concrete recommendations emerging from Ainu voices and human rights reports, laying out a path for a more just future. The consensus among Ainu leaders, scholars, and allies is that significant policy changes are needed for the Ainu to achieve real equality. Topping the list is the recognition of collective rights. The idea that the Ainu are not just a group of Japanese citizens with a shared culture, but a people with inherent rights as the first inhabitants of their land. This means Japan must move beyond seeing Ainu policy as a form of social welfare or cultural preservation and start seeing it as a matter of rights and restitution. Ainu advocates often say that Japan should treat the Ainu not as a charity case, but as a justice case. In practical terms, one major step would be to legally recognize Ainu collective ownership or stewardship of certain lands and resources in Hokkaido. This doesn't imply evicting restoring salmon fishing rights in Ainu traditional fishing grounds with sustainable quotas managed by Ainu would be a hugely significant move. It would both acknowledge their historical rights and help revive current practices. Land return could be symbolic, returning small but culturally important sites such as sacred lakes, burial grounds, or old village sites to Ainu control for protection and ceremonies. Free, prior, and informed consent should be consistent for development projects in areas of cultural significance to Ainu. If a new dam, highway, or industrial project is planned in Hokkaido, the Ainu people, the representative organizations, should have a say, potentially a veto if their heritage will be impacted. These are standards that UNDRIP calls for. If the Ainu person faces racial discrimination, say a hotel refuses them service after learning their Ainu, there's little they can legally do. A revised law should explicitly prohibit such acts and allow victims to seek remedies or penalties against perpetrators. This goes hand in hand with broader hate speech legislation. Japan's current hate speech laws are seen as inadequate, and strengthening them to cover hate based on indigenous status would protect. The act should also incorporate socioeconomic supports that are missing. As noted earlier, there are no guaranteed scholarships for Ainu students or targeted employee programs. Including such measures, for example, a scholarship fund for Ainu youth pursuing higher education or business grants for Ainu entrepreneurs, would directly tackle the economic disparities. Housing is another area. Some Ainu settlements historically lacked basic infrastructure. While much of that is improved, ensuring adequate housing and utilities in primary Ainu communities, perhaps through subsidies or prioritization in public housing, could potentially help alleviate poverty. Essentially, Japan needs to treat the upliftment of Ainu livelihoods with the same seriousness it treats the preservation of Ainu dances or crafts. Many Ainu advocates call for a degree of political representation to be baked into the system. One proposal that surfaces from time to time is to have designated seats for Ainu representatives in the national parliament or in the local assemblies in Hokkaido. This idea, inspired by models in New Zealand such as the Maori, or in Taiwan, which has some seats for indigenous groups, would guarantee that Ainu voices are present when laws are made, rather than relying on the goodwill of non-Ainu lawmakers. It would require legal changes, possibly a minor amendment to election laws or even the Constitution, but it would demonstrate that Japan is willing to adjust its democracy to be more inclusive. Short of that, the government could establish a formal Ainu council with real advisory power over any policy affecting the Ainu, not just a symbolic panel. A permanent council of Ainu representatives backed by law could review government actions and have the authority to demand constitutionalizations or changes. This ties into the concept of FPIC, rather than ad hoc constitutions. Institutionalized it via a council. The handling of Ainu ancestral remains and cultural artifacts is also on the reform agenda. Ainu communities seek the return of all remains and any sacred objects held in collections, as well as a proper reburial and memorial process led by Ainu spiritual leaders. They also want guarantees that going forward, any archaeological work in Hokkaido will involve Ainu constitutions to prevent further desecration. An Ainu Heritage Protection Act could be drafted to secure this, mandating that museums and universities come to the table to proprietary items and that important sites are legally protected. There's also a call to transform the role of places like Yukopoi, rather than a government-run, quote, theme park. It should have more Ainu management and include exhibits that openly describe the history of oppression. Some have suggested that part of Yukopoi or another facility have been turned into a national Ainu center for reconciliation, where Japanese visitors confront the historical truth, akin to how Canada has its human rights museums with sections of indigenous mistreatment. This educational mission is key to changing attitudes in the long term. Education reform is another prong of future action, integrating Ainu history and language into the mainstream education system would help combat ignorance and prejudice. Activists propose that the government develop official curriculum guides on Ainu history for schools nationwide, ensuring that every Japanese student learns about the Ainu not as a footnote, but as an integral part of the nation's history, including the negative parts like colonialization. Moreover, offering Ainu language courses in school and universities, even as electives, would give the language more visibility and respect. The creation of an Ainu university or research institution controlled by Ainu scholars has also been floated, a place to cultivate indigenous research and language revival at a higher education level. On the international front, pressure and support from outside can catalyze internal change. Moving forward, continued involvement of the UN and the international NGOs is expected. Japan's human rights records, including its treatment of the Ainu, comes up for periodic review. In those forums, other countries can and likely will continue to recommend actions. For example, ratifying ILO Convention 169 or indigenous rights. or implementing UN DRIP domestically. If Japan were to ratify ILO 169, it would be legally bound to stronger measures. For Ainu rights, it would be legally bound to stronger measures for Ainu rights, so activists frequently urge this step. International indigenous networks will also keep shining a spotlight. A failure by Japan to act, especially after its much publicized 2019 recognition law, could hurt its image as a modern democratic nation. This doesn't mean secession from Japan or forming an independent state. Virtually no Ainu voices call for that. Rather, it means having the autonomy to make decisions about their own culture, economy, and social development. In interviews, some Ainu elders expressed a dream of creating an Ainu-run village or district where Ainu traditions guide governance and economic practices existing alongside Japanese cities. In practice, achieving self-determination can mean establishing local Ainu communities that manage fishing rights, forest use, and cultural education in cooperation with municipal governments. Or it can mean Ainu-run schools and social services tailored for the community. These grassroots initiatives might flourish if supported by law and funding. It's clear that the role of the next generation will be pivotal. Young Ainu activists are tech-savvy, connected with global movements, and often more outspoken than their elders who had to be more cautious. They are organizing via social media, debunking stereotypes publicly, and pushing for faster change. Some have formed informal groups like Ainu Youth Association to pressure the official Ainu Association, which some see as too close to the government, to take a bolder stance. The synergy between these youth activists and elder knowledge keepers could define the path forward. Elders provide cultural wisdom and historical context, and youth provide energy and modern tactics. Together they are likely to continue reclaiming spaces, from academic conferences to local town halls, insisting that Ainu perspectives be heard. Finally, a crucial factor in the future is the attitude of Japanese society at large. Sustainable change will require not just top-down policy, but bottom-up shifts in public consciousness. These are signs of hope. Public awareness of the Ainu is higher now than perhaps in a century. Surveys show more Japanese people support to help the Ainu than those who oppose them. Cultural interest is growing. For example, travel programs on TV now sometimes feature Ainu cooking or music, treating it with respect. However, there's also a local nationalist segment that resents any accommodations for minorities, viewing them as a threat to national unity or undeserved privileges. Fighting that narrative and those nationalists is essential. This means more public education and perhaps less symbolic gestures of reconciliation. Some suggested that a member of the imperial family or the prime minister could visit an Ainu community and issue a clear apology for historical injustices, a moment that could sway public sentiment and acknowledge the pain caused. While Japan has a complicated relationship with apologies, given debates over wartime history, an apology to the Ainu might be more politically feasible and could help heal wounds. Japanese human rights progress. Just as South Africa's post-apartheid was measured by how it handled reconciliation, Japan's majority in the 21st century might be partly judged by how it treats its first inhabitants. The UN Special Rapporteur of Indigenous Peoples may make official visits and recommendations. Bodies like the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination are likely to continue to press Japan on why the Ainu still lack land rights and why Ryukyons aren't recognized. If Japan wants to be seen as a global leader in human rights, especially as it seeks a larger international profile, say with the aspirations for UN security membership, it may find it in its own interest to accelerate reforms for the Ainu. In sum, the road ahead for the Ainu is challenging, but filled with potential milestones. Achieving true equality and justice will require legal reforms, granting land, resource, and self-governance rights to the Ainu, ensuring anti-discrimination protections, such as Ainu representation in political bodies or empowered councils, and Ainu control over cultural and education initiatives. Economic and social support targeted at closing the gap in living standards guided by the principle of reparative justice for past harm. Cultural respect and revival supported at all levels of society, making Ainu language and traditions a celebrated part of Japan's diverse heritage rather than a footnote. Continued activism by Ainu people themselves, keeping up with the pressure and holding authorities accountable while educating their own youth and inviting allies to their cause. International engagement using global human rights norms and solidarity networks to bolster domestic efforts and assure Japan's into action. But there are reasons for optimism. The Ainu have proven time and time again their resilience and ability to adapt and persist. One elder told us, "Our existence today is our victory over those who predicted our disappearance." Every Ainu cultural class, every youngster learning an Ainu word, every public acknowledgement, these are victories accumulating. With sustained effort, the trajectory is bending toward justice. Ainu leaders often say they are fighting not only for their ancestors who suffered without seeing justice, but for their descendants, who they hope will live in a Japan where being Ainu carries no stigma, only pride. For that hope to be realized, Japan must confront its past and reshape its future policies. The Ainu are showing they will not settle for half measures. They are pushing for an equal place in their homeland, and they are not alone. The world is watching, and many within Japan are standing with them in solidarity. The story of the Ainu, from a thriving indigenous society to near cultural annihilation, and now a powerful movement of revival and resistance, is a testament to the human spirit's refusal to be erased. It's a chapter of Japan's history that can no longer be ignored, and the challenges to Japan's present to live up to principles of justice. In amplifying the Ainu perspective, we understand that it isn't just an indigenous story, but a human story of dignity, rights, and a quest for a more inclusive future. The Ainu journey continues, and its final pages have yet to be written. The hope is that those pages will tell of the true reconciliation, a Japan that fully embraces its first people, and an Ainu people sovereign in spirit who can finally feel equal and at home in their ancestral land. In the eyes of an empire, Black Americans, Native Americans, and the Ainu of Japan have all been made to suffer the same brutal refrain. Erase their language, outlaw their faith, and steal their land, and we'll call it civilization. No matter the continent, the colonizers' playbook was chillingly consistent. In the United States, government agents tore Native children from their families in masses. But in 1926, nearly 83% of all Native American school-age children were enrolled in coercive boarding schools designed to, quote, kill the Indian in him and save the man. Canada inflicted a similar horror. Over 150,000 Indigenous children sent to distant residential schools between 1983 and 1997. In Japan, the 1989 Hokkaido Former Aborigines Protection Act forced Ainu children into Japanese only schooling and banned the Ainu language and spiritual practices outright. So an ancient culture might be legislated out of existence. Enslaved Africans in America, too, were severed from their mother tongues and religions, stripped of our names as the plantation system strove to annihilate every connection to our homeland. After emancipation, new schemes of disposition took hold. Black American communities faced terror and Jim Crow laws that robbed us of our hard-won land and wealth. Black farmers who in the 1910s had owned 16 million acres saw their holdings plummet to just 4.7 million acres by 2017 through violence, theft, and discriminatory policy. All of these crimes were draped in legal sanctimony. Doctrines like the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius declared indigenous lands, quote, empty or the rightful spoils of Christian empires, denying Black, Native, and Ainu people any sovereignty on their own soil. And though Black and Native Americans endured the most direct physical cruelty, the lash of the slave master and the gun of the settler, centuries of chattel slavery and genocidal wars, all three people suffered profound violence beyond the physical, the slow burning violence of cultural annihilation. Psychological scars carried in blood and memory, whole ways of life ground into dust. Even today, the wound remains open. The median Black family in the U.S. holds barely 15% of the wealth of the median white family, a chasm born of slavery and segregation. Native American nations, having lost 98% of their original lands, still fight for every acre and waterway from the Standing Rock to Bear's Ears. The Ainu of Hokkaido officially declared quote, former Aborigines as if to erase them, only won recognition of their indigenous rights in the late 20th century and continue to battle for respect and resources. These disparities in wealth, in education, and health, the higher illness and poverty rates, the shorter lifespans are the living ghosts of colonization's legacies. Yet in the very fact of survival, in speaking forbidden languages and practicing relived traditions, there is a defiant poetry. Black, Native, and Ainu communities alike have turned silence into speech and suffering into strength, insisting that the story is not over. In an age eager to forget, their continued existence is an act of rebellion, a testament of what was stolen and a testament that what was stolen and oppressed can still rise, unbroken to demand justice and truth. In 1868, as the Japan Meiji government annexed Ainu lands to move to eradicate the Ainu language. Speaking Ainu was banned. Children were forced into Japanese-only schools, and Weijin, which means ethnic Japanese, customs were brutally imposed. This colonial policy of forced assimilation aimed to legislate the Ainu out of existence, silencing their tongue and culture under the myth of a homogeneous Japan. By the 1920s, observers noted the language was already critically endangered, spoken by a small fraction of Ainu children. Generations grew up punished for or ashamed of their mother tongue, and by the late 20th century, fluent native speakers of Ainu had dwindled to literally a handful. The once vibrant oral language, a unique language isolated with a gulitative grammar, had no proven relation to Japanese, and no proven relation to Japanese have been driven to the brink of extinction by state violence. Yet the Ainu refused to let their words die. Even under repression, some Ainu strived to save their speech in 1922. The 19-year-old Cherry Yuki painstakingly transcribed and published Ainu epic poems known as Yukar, and was the first time they had been written down, just days before she tragically died. Her work, Ainu Shimyoshu, preserved a precious piece of Ainu Aitak language, even as fluent speakers became scarce. After World War II, elders like Shigeru Kayona began recording oral histories and teaching what they could. But not until 1997 did Japan even legally permit Ainu language revitalization. That year, after a landmark court case, the government repealed the old ban and passed the first Ainu Culture Promotion Act. This allowed the establishment of Ainu language, classes, and modest cultural programs. Today, Ainu communities themselves lead a grassroots revival of their ancestral language initiatives. Initiatives include classes and radio lessons. Since 1987, radio programs have taught conversational Ainu, and since 1987, the Foundation for Ainu Culture, known as the FRPAC, has run regular language classes, including advanced courses, teacher training, and parent-child classes, using new teaching materials. These are often taught by Ainu elders and linguists, passing on vocabulary as well as to a new generation. In the Ainu heartland of Nibutani, local buses now play Ainu language announcements or stops. Many residents, over 80% of the Ainu heritage, smile to hear their ancestral works in daily life. With roughly 80% of Hokkaido place names originating from Ainu language, it is fitting that modern public spaces are embracing Ainu speech. Even Sapporo City plazas now display weather forecasts in Ainu alongside art exhibits, normalizing the language in the public sphere. There's also been a rise in youth-driven media, so a new generation of Ainu youth is harnessing digital media to teach and celebrate the language. For example, Ainu student Maya Sakimi runs a popular Cedo channel on YouTube offering friendly lessons on everyday Ainu phrases and conversations. She covers topics from self-introductions to traditional foods and songs, engaging young learners in Japan and abroad. Comments pour in from people thanking her for helping them study Ainu. Sakimi, who grew up in an Ainu community, also helped to record bus announcements and co-host radio lessons with her father, embodying how Ainu youth are proudly reclaiming their linguistic heritage in both traditional and modern ways. These community-led efforts are finally breathing life back into a language the Japanese authorities tried to extinguish. UNESCO now classifies Ainu as critically endangered, but no longer is it unspoken. One can hear Anen Karakaki, meaning hello, at festivals and classrooms on YouTube, and in daily greetings among proud Ainu speakers. After generations of state-enforced silence, the Ainu language is rising again, spoken aloud by those determined to ensure it never dies. Each new Ainu phrase learned, or old song sung is an act of resistance and cultural rebirth, proclaiming that Ainu Ikak will survive and thrive for future generations. Food sits at the heart of Ainu life and cosmetology, Food sits at the heart of Ainu life and cosmology, intertwined with spirituality, community, and the rhythms of the season. For millennia, the Ainu sustained themselves as adept hunters, fishers, and gatherers in Hokkaido's rich but harsh environment. Each season offers its gifts. In spring, mountain vegetables and wild herbs. In summer, trout and foraged berries. In autumn, abundant salmon runs and edible roots. In winter, deer and other game from the forest. Crucially, the Ainu understood these not merely as resources, but as sacred gifts. In Ainu belief, every animal and plant is inhabited by a kamoi, a spirit or deity who offers itself to humans as food. If people show proper respect and gratitude through ritual, the spirit will return to Kamoi realm and eventually come back again to provide sustenance once more. This cycle of respect forms a spiritual contract between the Ainu and the natural world. Ainu food practices were thus deeply spiritual. For example, salmon, called Kamoi Kisep, meaning divine fish, was regarded as a gift from the river Kamoi. The first salmon caught each year would be welcomed with a special ceremony called a Sir Sepnomi, meaning new salmon rice. The fish was brought into the home through a secret window, and the family spent days addressing its spirit with prayers, sake, and incense, thanking her for coming and offering it again. Only after this lengthy honoring of the salmon spirit, observed by the hearth goddess, would the community resume fishing, confident that the salmon community had been shown due respect. Similarly, when hunters took a bear from moon to the fur, they performed the Iomante send-off ceremony, releasing the bear's spirit with reverence, often by processing the bear's soul back to the Kamoi world with dance and offerings. In Ainu understanding, the bear was a god in animal form visiting the human world. By ritually sending it off with its favorite foods, like the people ensured the bear spirit would return happy and continue the cycle. Such ceremonies underscore the food for the Ainu was never taken lightly. It was a sacred exchange between humans and deities, requiring gratitude and restraint. Day-to-day Ainu cuisine was tied to what nature provided, perhaps in simple yet ingenious ways. Common traditional food included oshap soup, which was a hearty soup prepared by simmering meats or fish with wild vegetables as the base. Varieties were named by ingredients, for example, sep osha, which was salmon soup, or kam osha, animal meat soup. Osha was a staple at meals, often enriched with dried fish or animal fat for flavor. Unlike Japanese soups, the Ainu version used no soy sauce. Seasonings came from the natural oils of salmon, deer, and herbs, giving it a rich, nourishing taste. We also have wur, or radaskip, a thick stew of mixed wild plants and other ingredients boiled into soft and almost dry radikek, meaning mixed mash, typically combined wild greens and beans pounded or mashed together. In modern versions, Ainu's cooks might add potatoes or pumpkins, so they introduce vegetables along with native fruits and chicory berries, yielding a nutritionist paste. The dish is often flavored with animal boil or bone broth. Traditionally, rice is served as both daily fare and a special ceremonial dish highlighting the bounty of foraged foods. Sayo, a porridge of boiled grains, so this could contain foxtail millet, proso millet, and later rice, is often enjoyed alongside oka. Sayo is a light, energizing dish. Ainu cooks prepare it in dedicated pots to keep its flavor pure. There were many variants of sayo. Some mix a wild herbs or sapor, meaning dried salmon roe, for added protein. Eating a spoonful of warm sayo in between bites of fatty meat or fish helped cleanse the palate. We also have preserved salmon or saketobo. To ensure food during the long winters, the Ainu experimentally preserved salmon. In autumn, salmon were sliced into thin strips and hung in the cold sea breeze to make saketobi and dried salmon dressing. The fish was lightly salted, often by rinsing in seawater and air-dried until hard. Saketobi could last for months and be gently roasted and pounded into flakes for use in soups or eaten as a protein-rich snack. Similarly, salmon roe and even millet were dried and later added to the soup stock for safety. Nothing was wasted. Preservation techniques like smoking and sun-drying were honed over generations to maintain food supplies through lean times. The Ainu were remarkably sustainable in their harvest. They never uprooted all the wild plants when foraging, and they would leave roots intact so that edible ferns and bulbs would be grown next year. They took only what they needed, mindful that over-harvesting would offend the land's kamoi. Seasonal foods were diligently stored for winter, and fish caught in summer were smoked or roasted and dried for storage. Meat was preserved, and dried strips and nuts were buried in caches. In ceremonies, special foods like sito, millet dumplings, and mixed grain cakes were prepared for gods and ancestors, reinforcing that food fed not just the living, but the spiritual community as well. In short, food was at the core of Ainu existence, physically sustaining the people and spiritually binding them to nature and each other. The harmonious food system was devastated by Japanese settler colonialism. Starting in the Meiji era, one imperial indict after another criminalized Ainu food practices. By the 1870s, Ainu were forbidden to hunt deer or catch salmon except under colonial supervision. The new authorities seized Ainu hunting lands, cut off access to rivers, and destroyed the tradition salmon wears. Salmon fishing and deer hunting were banned outright as a matter of policy, a shocking blow to Ainu diet and culture. Ainu lifeways that had been passed down for generations were suddenly illegal. The Meiji government's 1899 Protection Act forced Ainu to take up sedentary farming on tiny plots of land in a misguided attempt to make them into Japanese-style peasant farmers. But by the time Ainu received these plots, most of the good land had already been taken by waging settlers, and many Ainu lacked tools or support for farming. They were effectively dispossessed of the forests and rivers that fed them. The result was devastating hunger and hardship. Ainu who had lived off salmon and game suddenly found themselves with meager rice rations and unfair crops that often failed. Historical records note that within a generation of colonization, many Ainu communities did not have enough food to survive. Malnutrition and famine struck as traditional food procurement was outlawed, and the new farms yielded little. Some Ainu were reduced to dependency on Japanese merchants or officials for food, further eroding their autonomy. Meanwhile, the colonial government portrayed this suffering as proof that Ainu were, quote, primitive, rather than admitting it was caused by violent displacement. The spiritual aspect of food was also targeted. Important rituals like the salmon send-off and bear ceremony were banned or discouraged as barbaric, severing their religious connection to animal kamoi. To the colonizers, Ainu food and ceremonies had to be erased to make way for modern Japanese civilization. And yet, even under this oppression, Ainu people resisted through food. They adapted in creative ways and kept their food culture alive in secret. Many Ainu families continued to forage for wild plants and hunt or fish discreetly to supplement their diet, risking punishment. Elders made sure to quietly teach the young how to identify edible plants, which means wild grains, and set traps for small animals. In some cases, Ainu men would obtain Japanese fishing license or hide among waging fishermen just to catch a few salmon for their family's needs. Ainu women maintained kitchen gardens of native herbs. Inside homes, away from prying colonial eyes, they still cooked oha with whatever traditional ingredients they could find, keeping the taste of Ainu culture alive. As one Ainu woman, Carol, today the Ainu are fighting to reclaim food sovereignty and celebrate their culinary heritage openly. In recent decades, a renaissance of Ainu food culture has begun, led by Ainu chefs, elders, and community organizers. In Hokkaido's Ainu village, there are workshops teaching youth how to gather wild vegetables like pukosa, which is Aluminum victorialis, a wild garlic, and pegas, which is butter burr, as our ancestors did. Traditional techniques of preserving salmon, drying, smoking, fermenting, or being revived through community projects. Some Ainu families have returned to fishing in local rivers on a limited basis with special permits, not just for ceremony but for sustenance, reasserting their rights to the fish runs that their ancestors managed sustainably for years. These grassroots efforts connect to a broader indigenous food sovereignty movement, asserting that Ainu have the right to access traditional foods and maintain their food-related ceremonies. In the culinary world, Ainu chefs and restaurants are bringing Ainu cuisine to wider audiences. A notable example is Haikor, the only Ainu restaurant in Tokyo run by Ainu women and run by an Ainu woman named Terio Usa, opened over a decade ago. Haruka is a mini revolution in reclaiming Ainu foodways. Usa drew inspiration from her mother and grandmother's recipes, determined to take all the feelings and the cultures of her ancestors and pass them on. On Haruka's menu, she serves dishes like lettuce sketch made with mashed pumpkins, tigers, beans, and bitter shakir berries. A tame-looking stew that surprises patrons with its complexity. She flavors Japanese fried rice with kiromo piro, Ainu wild garlic, and garnishes plates with pickled hashkat berries and other foraged spices. Large jars of these traditional ingredients line the restaurant counter, visibly reclaiming space for Ainu flavors in modern culinary scene. By sourcing as many ingredients as possible from Hokkaido Ainu communities, salmon, venison, veal, wild greens, Usa supports her people's economic survival as well. Her restaurant has introduced countless Tokyo diners to the taste of osho sata, dried meat, and sakakasu, fermented fish head soup, fostering appreciation and curiosity about Ainu culture through food. It stands as a defiant counterpoint to centuries of erasure. Ainu cuisine publicly celebrated in Japan's capital. Back in Hokkaido, Ainu cultural centers and museums also showcase food tradition. At the new Floyd National Ainu Museum, visitors can watch demonstrations of akima, fish drying and dried salmon, samples of oha and pseudo dumplings. Younger Ainu are learning these methods and are even innovating on them. For instance, experimenting with modern ingredients while keeping the spirit of the dishes. Importantly, Ainu are regaining pride in the food that was once foreign by mainstream society. Dishes like mipan, which is salted fish entrails, or supportsu, which is roast soup, which older generations were pressured to abandon, are now being recognized as delicacies and key parts of Ainu heritage. However, food sovereignty is still a struggle. Ainu rights to traditional resources remain restricted by law. In fact, to this day, salmon fishing in rivers is technically illegal in Japan except for scientific or ceremonial purposes, and Ainu must obtain special permissions from authorities to keep salmon even for rituals. Commercials or subsistence fishing by Ainu is not generally allowed, a lingering legacy of Meiji-era ban. In 2020, a group called the Rappo Ainu Nation in eastern Hokkaido filed an unprecedented lawsuit seeking to restore their ancestral right to fish salmon in local river for livelihood. They argued that their people have lived off of those salmon for centuries until the government's assimilation policy banned it in the early Meiji period, and that the international indigenous rights standards, like the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, obliged Japan to allow Ainu sustainable use of natural resources. This case was effectively a test of Ainu food sovereignty. In 2024, however, the Sapporo District Court rejected the Ainu claim, ruling that salmon in the river are public property and that recognizing exclusive Ainu fishing rights would go beyond cultural preservation. The Ainu's continuous fishing tradition yet still denied their inherent rights, reflecting an ongoing colonial mindset that prioritizes state control over Ainu self-determination. The plaintiffs were devastated but vowed to appeal. This modern legal battle highlights that while Ainu cuisine might be celebrated in museums and restaurants, Ainu is still fighting for legal access to the very foods that compromise that cuisine. Despite these challenges, movements to regain Ainu food sovereignty presses on with determination. Ainu leaders emphasize that connecting with traditional food is a cornerstone of the Young Ainu activists organized wild plant foraging trips and salmon harvest camps to teach the next generation practical skills and cultural meaning. There's a deep understanding that reclaiming the right to harvest and eat their indigenous foods is part of reclaiming dignity and agency. Every bowl of sip-o-ha shared at a community gathering, every Ainu-run salmon hatchery project, every new field of millet sown on ancestral land is both an act of cultural resurgence and a form of resistance against colonial domination. In the face of centuries of disposition, the Ainu are declaring that we will feed ourselves on our own terms. By bringing back their recipes, reasserting their rights to hunt and fish, and teaching their children the old food ways, the Ainu assure that their culture survives regardless. Food, which was used as a weapon to control them, has become a tool of empowerment through the revitalization of Ainu cuisine and food sovereignty. The Ainu people nourish not only their bodies, but also their collective sphere of revival. Ikoro, to have riches in Ainu, was never about gold or money, but about abundant food and well-being. In reviving their food culture, the Ainu will regain their true riches, the taste of freedom and the sustenance of their heritage. Japan's treatment of Ainu was a case study in settler colonial oppression, decades of conquest and forced assimilation followed by only token gestures of recognition. From the Meiji era to today, the Japanese state has systematically denied the Ainu meaningful rights, seeking to destroy their identity or absorb it into a colonial narrative. The history is one of broken promises and legal evasion. Here we chronologically expose how Japanese laws and policies from 1899, 1997, and 2019 have repeatedly failed the Ainu, and how even recent steps remain woefully insufficient. We do so in no uncertain terms. The government's actions have been pro-forma and paternalistic, continuing the legacy of imperialism under a veneer of multiculturalism. In 1899, the Protection Act, in name only, was the first formal Ainu, known as the 1899 Hokkaido Former Aborigines Protection Act, a grotesquely misnamed piece of legislation designed to assimilate and dispossess. Its very title labeled Ainu as, quote, former Aborigines, implying they had ceased to exist as a people, even as it placed them under special supervision. The act stripped Ainu of their land rights and declared all Ainu territory property of the state. In practice, it confiscated Ainu traditional lands and resources and then doled out small plots, typically inferior land to Ainu families for farming. Hunting, fishing, and Ainu economic activities were severely curtailed or banned. The act forced Japanese language and education on Ainu children and outlawed most Ainu cultural practices from tattooing to ritual ceremonies. The paradox of this law is that while purporting to protect Ainu, it actually entrenched their oppression. It singled them out as a ward population to be managed and civilized, thereby symbols to the president. By subjecting Ainu to patronizing invasive measures, the Protection Act ensured the survival of anti-Ainu discrimination with the modern Japanese state. The Ainu were made of second-class citizens. They were given Japanese citizenship normality, but not the same rights. For example, they could not freely sell or lease the land plots given to them, and face restrictions that the Waijin farmers did not. The act was intended to make the Ainu Japanese an identity, but in reality it created a permanent underclass. It is telling that the Japanese officials at the time spoke of the Ainu as a race on the verge of disappearance. This law's purpose was to accelerate that disappearance through assimilation. Under it, Ainu land was stolen and their governance systems dismantled, and the government congratulated itself for modernizing the Ainu. The 1899 Act stayed in force for almost 100 years, a testament to Japan's refusal to revise its colonial stance for so long. Some of its most blatantly oppressive provisions were reportedly loosened in the 1930s as the core framework remained. The damage it caused, land loss, economic marginalization, cultural suppression, echoed through generations. From 1900s to 1940s, official erasure began. For the first half of the 20th century, including the wartime period, the Japanese government largely pretended the Ainu problem was solved. They viewed Ainu as essentially assimilated or destined to die out. The state's propaganda pushed the notion of Japan as a monoethnic nation with no room for indigenous minorities. Ainu were constructed into Japanese society without acknowledgement of their distinct status. There was no legal avenue for Ainu to appeal for rights or recognition under the imperial regime. Some Japanese intellects debated Ainu treatment, but no substantive changes occurred. It was only after World War II, under the new constitution's ideas, that Ainus began to organize openly. Example would be the formation of the Hokkaido Ainu Association in 1946. Still, the myth of homogeneity persisted. Incredibly, it was not until 1991 that the Japanese government officially admitted in the UN Human Rights Report that the Ainu were an ethnic minority in Japan. For decades after the war, Japanese officials clung to this falsehood that, quote, "We are all Japanese, there are no minorities," effectively rendering the Ainu invisible in policy. This denial was a form of continued erasure. By refusing to see Ainu as a people with rights, the government evaded responsibilities for addressing their grievances. Then in 1997, the Ainu Culture Promotion Law took place. By the late 20th century, pressure had mounted for Japan to change its stance. Ainu leaders have been campaigning tirelessly for recognitions and rights, and internationally Japan was facing criticism for its treatment of indigenous people. A turning point came when the 1997 Nabuti Dam case, where the Sapporo District Court when the Sapporo District Court in a groundbreaking decision recognized the Ainu as an indigenous people with a unique culture, and ruled that the government had failed to consider Ainu cultural rights when expropriating land for a dam. The case was brought by the late Shinkiro Kiyano and others after the sacred land in Nabuti was taken for a dam. The court stopped short of halting the dam, which was already built, but it was a moral victory. The same year, perhaps feeling the heat, the Diet finally repealed the 1899 Act and replaced it with a new law, the 1997 Act on Encouragement of Ainu Culture and Dissemination of Knowledge of Ainu Traditions, commonly called the Ainu Culture Promotion Act. Superficially, 1997 marked progress. It was the first time the government enacted legislation that wasn't overtly assimilationist. The new law's language spoke of respecting Ainu culture and promoted things like Ainu language, classes, cultural centers, and the study of Ainu traditions. However, Ainu activists were deeply disappointed. The law did not address the core issues. It failed to provide any acknowledgement of Ainu calls for land or resource rights or for political representation. In other words, it was strictly cultural in scope, treating Ainu culture as a thing to be preserved and displayed, rather than Ainu people as sovereign entities with rights. There were no provisions for returning ancestral lands, no rights to fish, hunt, no measures to improve Ainu political power or economic status. It offered zero compensation or apologies for past injustices. Many Ainu felt it was a repackaging of old paternalism. The government would fund folk dance performances and Ainu craft exhibitions, but continued to deny Ainu any say over their destiny. Indeed, the act itself established a committee, later the Foundation for Research and Promotion of Ainu Culture, largely run by government appointees. Early on, many events under the acts were organized by non-Ainu experts, which Ainu community was not patronizing. This top-down structure meant Ainu had limited control, even if the cultural domains supposedly meant for them. The 1997 law was passed unanimously, reflecting a sense among Japanese politicians that they had done enough by acknowledging Ainu culture as part of Japan's heritage. But far from satisfying Ainu's demands, it fueled further debate about indigenous rights and self-determination. That culture cannot flourish under continued disempowerment. As activists, in short, the 1997 Act was a half step, framed more as a preserving a dying culture than empowering a living people. Then from 2000 to 2008, symbolic recognition without rights occurred. In the 2000s, international pressure intensified. Japan in 2007 voted in favor for the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, which affirms rights to self-determination, land, resources, and cultural practices. However, Japan had no domestic law reflecting those principles. On the eve of the 2008 G8 summit in Hokkaido, likely to avoid international embarrassment, the Japanese Diet unanimously passed a resolution formally recognizing the Ainu as indigenous people of Japan. This 2008 parliamentary resolution, a one-page statement, was welcomed by many as a long overdue acknowledgement. But crucially, it was non-binding and had no actionable provisions. Some Ainu did feel a sense of pride and hoped it would lead to improved attitudes, but there was no follow-up plan as to restore Ainu rights or address grievances. The timing was also really suspect. Critics pointed out that Japan only acted weeks before hosting an international summit, likely to bolster its international image and perhaps strengthen its position regarding to disputed Coral Islands, which was claimed by Russia. The resolution felt like a PR move, and it was a PR move. After it passed, the government set up a temporary advisory council for future Ainu policy in 2009, which included Ainu representatives and scholars to discuss measures. This led to some funds for language programs and eventually plans for a national Ainu museum. But again, nothing about land rights or autonomy. The core of state policy did not shift, and Ainu were recognized in words as indigenous, yet not granted any specific indigenous rights under law. In 2009, the Ainu Policy Promotion Act, it was the most recent development, was the passing of the new Ainu law in April 2019, which the government touted as a historic step. The law, officially the Ainu law, for the first time wrote into Japan's legal code that Ainu are indigenous people and that discrimination against them is not allowed. Superficially, this sounded monumental, but upon further reading, Ainu leaders and experts quickly criticized the 2019 act. It promised cultural promotion but no rights. The law focuses on measures like boosting tourism to Ainu areas, supporting Ainu cultural projects, and encouraging regional revitalization involving Ainu culture. It provides small subsidies to local governments for things like folk craft markets and the operation of the new National Ainu Museum. It also includes vague language about respecting the pride of Ainu and stipulates that the government will address discrimination. But what it does not include is very telling. There is no provision whatsoever for returning Ainu lands or recognizing any form of Ainu land stewardship. No special fishing or hunting rights granted, no rights to natural resources, no framework for Ainu political participation or self-government, and no compensation for historical injustices. In fact, the law explicitly avoids using the term rights at all. Ainu activists noted that while the law claims to uplift Ainu, it seriously omits any acknowledgement of indigenous rights or sovereignty. So for example, the century-old ban on salmon fishing remains. Ainu can only fish salmon with prefectural permissions for cultural ceremonies, and the 2019 law did not change that. When the act was being drafted, Ainu representatives pushed for language about resource rights. The final version had none. Instead, the act showcase project was Upopoi, a national Ainu museum park in Shirahoi that opened in 2020.
確かに今ね、マイノリティの人たちって言われる人たちが差別的な扱いを受けたり人権侵害されることは多いですけれども、やっぱり今までやってきたことに対し例えばもう強制的にその人たちの文化だとか生活を規制してきたことに対してね、それが良かったかどうかっていうことをやっぱり反省してもらったり謝罪してもらったり、それと私たちとやっぱり対等な立場で話し合うということが必要ですよね。そのためにきちんと日本政府はアイヌの人たちの声を聞いてくださいっていうことに対して皆さんが連帯して、どこのそういう先住民族の人たちもそういう同じような道をたどってる人たちがいればそういうところはきちんと国は向き合っていくべきだっていうことにやっぱり連帯してもらうことが必要かなと思いますね。
Can you tell her I said thank you?
I think that it's just beautiful because it's like an act of human compassion that just keeps making the rounds through generations. And I wish that there was more incidents like that just across the globe. So I guess to my next question is just about the future for Ainu people.
What do you see as the future for Ainu people, and what ways can the Japanese government make changes to provide a better and safer environment?
アイヌ民族はその自然界と共生して生きてきましたからね。生活のすべてを自然界からいただくから、それを感謝して使い、でまた自然界に感謝の気持ちを返すっていう、その共存をしてきたっていうのは、今までこう他の今の社会はね、もう科学だとか医学だとかいろんなことがもう発達してきて、どんどんこう自分たちでもう宇宙も全部支配できるっていうふうに思い込んで多分来たと思うんですよね。私もそう思ってたこともありましたけれども、このコロナとかなんとか、戦争、また戦争が起こったりとか、本当に人間コロナもね、こんなに科学も医学も宗教もたくさんあるのに、誰も止められないんじゃないですかっていう感じ。本当に今こそその自然界とやっぱりその新たなね、二次的に何か作ってきたりすることはできるけれども、実際はやっぱり自然界から全てもらわなかったら誰も生活していけないわけなんだから、やっぱりそこに立ち返るという意味で私たちが発信するとか、今まで一番近年まで受け継いできたその考えとか、そういったものをやっぱり発信していくことがすごい大事になっていくと思うんですよね。で、人権問題も要するにこう自分たちと違うものとか、植民地化したとかどうか制作したものに対してそういう格差をつけて搾取したり、いろんな人権侵害したりするけれども、そういうことをやっていけばやがて自分たちのそういう番が来てしまう。自分たちはずっとそんな立場にならないと思ってるかもしれないけど、私何十年も見ていると、もともとはね、アイヌだとかブラックだとかね、アフリカンアメリカンの人たちとかね、そういう人たちだけが差別を受けるって、今もう差別を受ける人たくさんじゃないですか。もう LGBT の人だ、福島だ、あれだこれだ、もう戦争をやってもされるとかって、本当に自分だけがだとかね、そういう思った考えをしていたらやがて本当に滅びてしまいます。だからね、私というよりも先住民族のこの宇宙地球とあれのその自然界との関わりみたいなことにやっぱり立ち返る、考え方立ち返るっていうことが重要だと思うし、それはもう政治でもいろんなところにも人を大切にする時に自分が大切にされるんだっていう考え方を基づいてやっていかなければ、いつまでも自分たちを支配する、ね、全部持っている人間だっていうことにはこれからはならないっていうふうに私は思ってますし、私はそのために喋っていきますしみんなと連帯して頑張っていきたいと思う。政府にも訴えます。
And just my last question before so much for the interview, and it's okay if I give her a hug or I don't know.
タリアの方が
As a thank you, I don't know.
ありがとうございます。感謝の印でアメリカではよくこう抱擁ハグをするんです。
I am just like really moved by her story and her grandmother's story. Like, yeah.
Hi.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like it.
Thank you. And she has so much courage to like just do everything that she's doing right now. Like she's like a superwoman.
でも生活していけないわけなんだから、やっぱりそこに立ち返るという意味で私たちが発信するとか、今まで一番 近年まで受け継いできたその考えとかそういったものをやっぱり発信していくことがすごい大事になっていくと思うんですよね。で人権問題も要するに自分たちと違うものとか植民地化したとかどうか政策したものに対してそういう格差をつけて搾取したりいろんな人権侵害したりするけれどもそういうことをやっていけばやがて自分たちのそういう番が来てしまう。自分たちはずっとそんな立場にならないと思ってるかもしれないけど私何十年も見ているともともとはねアイヌだとかブラックだとかねアフリカンアメリカンの人たちとかねそういう人たちだけが差別を受けるって今もう差別を受ける人たくさんじゃないですか。もう LGBT の人だ福島だあれだこれだもう戦争をやってもされるとかって本当に自分だけがだとかねそういう思った考えをしていたらやがて本当に滅びてしまいます。だからね私というよりも先住民族のこの宇宙地球とあれのその自然界との関わりみたいなことにやっぱり立ち返る考え方立ち返るっていうことが重要だと思うしそれはもう政治でもいろんなところにも人を大切にする時に自分が大切にされるんだっていう考え方を基づいてやっていかなければいつまでも自分たちを支配する、全部持っている人間だっていうことにはこれからはならないっていうふうに私は思ってますし私はそのために喋っていきますしみんなと連帯して頑張っていきたいと思う政府にも訴えます。
And just my last question before we go is what can people abroad and internationally do to help support the Ainu people's fight for liberation and justice?
最後の質問になりますが、世界から、このドキュメンタリーを視聴している、世界中にいる視聴者など、アイヌの、人権、問題に関心を寄せている人たち、が連帯してどのようなことを、すれば、そうですね、アイヌの方々の、個人権を守ることにつながるのでしょうか。どういった形で連帯を、示せるでしょうか。
はい。
It's a hard question. Hard to say, I guess.
いや確かに今ねマイノリティの人たちって言われる人たちが差別的な扱いを受けたり人権侵害されることは多いですけれどもやっぱり今までやってきたことに対し例えばもう強制的にその人たちの文化だとか生活を規制してきたことに対してねそれが良かったかどうかっていうことはやっぱり反省してもらったり謝罪してもらったりそれと私たちとやっぱり対等な立場で話し合うということが必要ですよね。そのためにきちんと日本政府はアイヌの人たちの声を聞いてくださいっていうことに対して皆さんが連帯して、どこのそういう先住民族の人たちもそういう同じような道をたどっている人たちがいればそういうところはきちんと国は向き合っていくべきだっていうことにやっぱり連帯してもらうことが必要かなと思いますね。
Can you tell her I said thank you so much for the interview and it's okay if I give her a hug or I don't know.
キャリアの方がちょっと
As a thank you, I don't
あり
know.
がとうございます。感謝の印でアメリカではよくこう抱擁ハグをするんですけれども、差し支えないでしょうか。
アイヌもそうなんですよ。ハグするんですよ。
Thank you. Honestly, like this was really like amazing.